Hello again. Hello again. This is the second video for Seminar 4, where we're looking at planning, particularly in the humanitarian context. And I'm looking at the PowerPoint slides, and I'm looking at number 13. And the thing that you'll notice when we look at what's happening in planning in the humanitarian context is that some of the same principles apply, however, the context is really quite different. I guess part of that too is because often humanitarian agencies are outside of a community or an area and they come into that area to work. And there's issues around how that community has been selected to work with in the first instance. It's not always at the initiative of the community. It's often as a response to a crisis, a humanitarian disaster, environmental crisis, including war. So the context has a huge impact on even the initial stages of how an organisation, an agency or a government approaches a community. Usually it is around the assessment of that need. So, as I just said, it's about the emergency. There's something that has occurred. There's a disaster. But what we're really wanting to emphasise here is that before any disaster takes place, whether it's a humanitarian, environmental, that good planning, if that has been in place at the outset, that's going to make a huge difference to the effectiveness of any community work that takes place. I'm looking on slide number 15, and what that's really highlighting, the quote that is there, saying given the recurring nature of natural disasters, the theme of disaster preparedness in vulnerable communities, which mainly focuses on developing the ability to respond quickly and appropriate, is a cornerstone of disaster relief activity. So again, it's emphasising the preparation, the planning, the foresight, the thinking that has taken place prior to any disaster happening is hugely important and is going to impact on how that intervention or how that work takes place. When we're talking about the preparedness, I'm looking at slide 16 here. When we're talking about the preparedness, what really should have taken place prior is that there should be consultation and involvement with as many stakeholders as possible. And it's not just an agency driven, it's not just a government driven, it's not just an organisation driven process, but it involves key community leaders and significant people in the area. And the plan is something that is known about and is accessible to everyone. An example that I gave during the class, which I guess illustrates this point, is that recently in Darwin there have been bomb threats made. There's been phone calls made to a number of schools in the area, and in response to that, CDU has looked at their own policies and their own practices, and on the CDU website there are instructions for everybody, for staff and students, about what you should do in the event of there being a bomb threat. And things such as don't use your mobile phone, that information, we hope we never have to use that information, but it's an example of sharing the plan, saying to people, this is what you do in this situation, this is the best possible steps that you can take to avoid danger, to keep yourself and others safe. Everyone can read that on the CDU website. So if a plan exists, it is going to make all the difference to how a post-emergency response will be if that's in place. Otherwise, the likelihood of decisions that are made following a disaster are likely to be very top-down and often led by outside people, led by workers, led by agencies, led by the experts, and not always in consultation with the locals. So it can appear necessary, and in some cases it is, in emergency situations where there are lives at risk and there's needs to prepare and protect vulnerable people. However, if there hasn't been consultation significantly with the community about how that plan, how that intervention is going to take place, often there can be longer term resentment and trauma. And one example of that also is the bushfires in Victoria a few years ago. One of the feedback that came following those bushfires and the intervention of post-disaster supports, community responses, how the government responded, how local agencies responded. In some areas, people in those communities who were now safe and who had received some of the supports and the assistance to get their lives back together, there was sometimes resentment and anger because they were not consulted, or services came in and did things to them and for them and offered assistance without consulting with them and without finding out who are the key people here that we need to talk to, or what have you already done about this. So the involvement of people, even in situations where they are urgent and their emergency, is really critical. So we're talking about the importance then of being prepared, and I'm looking at slide number 17. And one way, well, there are many ways in which preparedness before a disaster takes place. It requires resources and organisation, and I'm looking at slide 17, and the first point there is around monitoring, mitigation and risk reduction. So it's about actually having good data, so information about where people are living, who are the vulnerable people, where are the schools, where are the health services. It's about having a really good map of all of that information, and not just focusing on one part of the system, but actually looking at all the different parts of where people are and what the services are, what the physical lie of the land is in an area. So building awareness is about sharing that information with people broadly about what would be happening. So particularly also in natural disaster management planning is really focusing too on vulnerability. So looking at who are the people who are most likely to be at risk, who are the people who are going to have difficulties, for example, getting out of their homes quickly in the event of a natural disaster, a bushfire. Who are the people we need to be thinking about? How are we going to get access to those people? How are we going to have systems in place to consider moving old, frail people who may not have access to transport? So linking all of these stages, the forecasting, the mitigation response and the recovery to community development for resilience, the plan needs to have all of these parts in it so that they connect. There also really need to be the protocols around, this is the bigger picture, the strategic planning, when you step back and you look at what can happen in the future, looking at the bigger picture, looking further down the track. That is the strategic planning part. And that is looking at where are the protocols, how would we get international support, what international support is there, how do we have training available, logistics training for people, and having simulation programs, having practice runs. So ensuring that there's adequate funding is critical for all of the stages. So if there's a plan about how we're actually going to, for example, move people who need extra support to get out of their houses, if there's no funding for each of these stages, then the plan is not going to be effective. I'm looking at slide 18, and that's just looking at the response that needs to include a broad acknowledgement of government. It needs to be local government as part of that, as well as the government representative organisation that is closest to where the people are living. So coordinated through the needs assessments, so through again knowing what's available in the community, knowing what is already there and knowing what the gaps are, and the importance of having collaboration between different services, organisations and government. That needs to include everybody: churches, schools, health services, volunteer groups, as well as government, as well as coordinating bodies. How do we have coordination and collaboration between all of those parties? So availability of a logistician, cadre, really crucial in a natural disaster management plan. How those plans are going to be implemented, and how the cross-agency reporting, so communication and feeding back to different parts of the system, different agencies, how are they getting information, how are they being updated, how are they accessing that information, and then how are they sharing that information with people in their own group. Relationship building needs to be occurring all the time, and that is so critical with communication, that people need to be receiving really clear messages about what's happening, about where they get support, about what they're entitled to, who is coming into their community, who is at service, who is at organisation, how are they offering assistance. That's done through communication and through building the relationship with the local community. And understanding too that the response is part of a longer term way of working with communities, that the relationships often are going to continue for a long time when there are outside agencies implementing action following a disaster. Acknowledging that people also, why they need assistance, they need emergency supplies, they need medical supplies, they often need food. People also are resilient and resourceful. So how that is actually acknowledged, acknowledging the skills of the people who are still in the area, how they can be supported to be active in that plan after a disaster is critical. So assuming that the community still does have some capacities, that yes, people are experiencing trauma and impacted on by what has just occurred, however people are still wanting to be involved in, wanting to be consulted, wanting to be part of that community in the future. I'm looking at slide 20 now, and it just really is highlighting that as time moves on after a disaster, that developmental work and working with key community leaders and people in the area is really critical, and it's a different stage as people regroup, as people rebuild their lives. This can really vary in terms of how long that time will take, but then different approaches will be involved in them. What can often start as an urgent response to an emergency can be initially quite top-down, but that should change over time and to be more inclusive of involving communities and involving community members. I'm looking at, there's some videos that you can watch on slide 22 in your own time. I guess just stepping back a bit and looking at some of the debates and the criticisms of social planning on slide 22. It can be, as we were talking about earlier, it can be seen to be too top-down, that it can be focused on experts or people from outside coming to an area, coming to a town, coming to a community and doing some investigation and have already made some decisions about what is happening, and that process can be seen to be too top-down, and it can also lack the input of the community. It can assume as well, the process, that the community doesn't have its own ideas or its expertise or its skills, and the process can focus on gaps and focus on the deficits. And it can also be labelling of communities, that community planning is something that can be acted on when there's seen to be a problem and things are not going well in that area. So it can be seen as part of a labelling activity. So being aware of community and social planning is something that as workers we need to be very mindful about and thinking about. Is it a tool that I could use? Is it something that could be part of good community practice? And be aware of the debates and the discussions around that. That's all.